Good afternoon or good morning, Camille. It's so nice to be able to see you. I've had the pleasure of having your students as Shango students for many, many years. And I reached out to you recently about a book that I came across called The Oldest Student, How Mary Walker Learned to Read, which is a very popular book right now at Shango. And I'm hearing that your kids have read the book as well. Reading The Oldest Student, How Mary Walker Learned to Read. It's written by Rita Lorraine Hubbard, who's a former special education teacher in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the illustrator is Oji Mara, who is a Caldecott Medal finalist.
I liked the book. The art's really cool, and I don't usually see picture books like that. It's usually just all hand-drawn, but it's kind of like in a collage way for this one. And I really liked the story.
But you had a chance to read this book, and I'm just wondering, how did that book make you feel about the books that we're putting in front of our kids at school?
Well, first of all, Karen, thank you so much for the time. It's a pleasure always to speak with you. I appreciate you as an educator and an administrator and what you do for the kids. And I thought this book was eye-opening. It was interesting because initially when you reached out, I hadn't heard of it. Tess had read it, my daughter, and Wyatt had not. And so I got a little bit of her perspective, but then also got the chance to read it. And it's truly a treasure. I'm glad that we put these books in front of our children. And I think that it's something that we need to make a concerted effort to give a diversity of books. And I thought that this story just had so many themes in it that are important for all children, really.
I thought it was great. It was one of those stories where it has a happy ending and you finish the book like, oh yeah, that was a good story. I enjoyed reading that.
Thank you. Was there anything when you read the book that kind of like it stuck in your heart and you just couldn't get it out of your heart or your head?
Yes. And I think that's kind of because of the theme, obvious, right? So and for me personally, in my experience, so when I heard about Mary's story and about how she couldn't read, and we all know the reasons why that was the case, right? She came from a slave family where there were not, it was not valued to educate them, obviously. And my father, his grandfather was a sharecropper. So I understood that theme, and I had heard stories about things like that and about how education was so valued in my household, largely because of that. And so I just remember thinking, to keep so much of the world experience away from another human being by not allowing them to read is really hard in some ways to digest. But to see her story of perseverance through all those years and to still at her age of over 100 to learn to read was just so compelling from a story of just perseverance.
I definitely felt happy that she finally learned how to read.
Thank you. So when I was reading it, the first thing that struck me was, how come I'd never heard of this before?
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought that I had an upbringing that would have exposed me to a lot more than I've been exposed to. So the first thing that struck me was, how did I not know this? And then the next thing that struck me is that Mary Walker learned to read the year before I was born. So to me, she's current. And here I've gone through public schools as a K through 12 student. I went to a public New York State college. I got my admin degree from a public New York State college. And I was taught that the best way to positively impact families in your community is through education. And I believe that. And when I read this book, the underlying tones that I picked up on were that it was illegal to teach slaves to read. So it was intentional.
Mm-hmm.
The quickest way to remove a person from being successful is to deny the ability to read. And one thing I'm wondering though is, you're a mom of 2 kids. Like, how do your kids feel about this book?
I think that they, it's another example of the fact that things like this that happened really weren't that long ago. And so are there ways that it's manifesting itself today? Who knows? Let's hope not. But they're aware of that. Like, I think that there are, the time that we live in, they have experienced things that they were taught in school in terms of social studies and civil rights movements and things like that. And then they look at their lived experience and say, oh, well, I thought that in school they told us this was all handled. And so I think also keeping stories like this alive helps them understand that in one way it wasn't that long ago, and in another way we need to make sure that the history doesn't repeat itself. And so that's kind of what comes out in the conversations with them.
So one of the things that I have been striving to do once I realized that the history lessons that I learned were not as accurate as I thought that they were, and there were huge omissions in the history, was to work really hard to get diverse books in front of all of our children, to have picture books, not just novels, but picture books, to have uncomfortable stories, to have different stories, young authors. And I'm just wondering what the impact of putting these books in classrooms for all children to have access to in the pre-Ks, in the kindergarten classrooms, even before they're readers. What do you think the impact is of diverse books in front of kids when they're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 years old?
I think the impact is just the ability to show that we welcome all different types of people. We can see imagery of all different types of people and know that there are more ways that we are alike than we are different. So it's important to know the stories of the history and to know the experiences of those people, but to also realize that we're really all the same. And so I can put myself into that story and say, wow, what did that make me feel? How did that make me feel? And let's talk about things that, like you said, are difficult, or maybe the realities are different than what we had originally learned. And if we put those in front of children earlier and earlier, just think of how that can manifest itself later in their lives and in their careers. I think there's a huge opportunity. And I think that we may not see it all play out in our generation, but to know that they can make huge changes, I think it starts really early.
What I also really appreciate about the books that I am actively seeking for our students is that the artwork is different. It's outside of the parameter of art that I learned when I was a child. The pictures in the back, the black and white photos, that's what I learned. One of the things I've tried to do is, before selecting a text that goes into all the classrooms, I strive to ask myself, who is this story about? And is the author connected to the culture that the author is writing about?
Mm-hmm.
And if they are, in what way? Because I've been trying really hard to have people who want to tell a story tell your story, not the story that you researched in a history book.
Mm-hmm.
So have you come across books that you feel that the story is told from perhaps a proper perspective or an improper perspective? Have you come across any texts like that when you're reading with your kids?
I do think that the combination of the words and really pairing the illustrators, I think, is really powerful. I have noticed that as well. And I noticed that my children seek out those books, and the whole category of graphic novels is really popular. And so I think that there's an opportunity there to marry the unique stories with the illustrators to broaden all children's experience, including my own children's. I think initially I thought, oh, are they somehow downplaying the quality of the writing by having so much imagery? And then once I started to look at some of the things that they were seeking out, I thought, no, it's actually an opportunity to really let them know that there's, to your point, all different types of art. And then also there's a way to complement and extend even the story through the imagery, particularly with diverse illustrators and writers.
Because sometimes just looking at scrolls and scrolls of just letters is sometimes boring, and you gotta maybe need some help visualizing what a certain bit of a story looks like.
I really like the fantasy ones with like dragons and talking animals and stuff. And the ones that are folktales that have a lesson at the end, so it's a fun story that's made up and magical, and then there's a purpose to it.
And are there any themes that you think younger kids should be exposed to, maybe that you found out about later in your education that you think kids should know about earlier?
Anything about making things, like making artwork or writing stories, because it always feels better when you help make it.
One of the new books, well, not new books really, for the book tournament thing, the book Soaked, I really liked that one.
But he's been on a Lemony Snicket.
Yeah, I
Jag.
definitely enjoy Lemony Snicket.
Yeah. I do, and I think I've changed my thinking on that recently. I used to think, wow, these graphic novels, they're so focused on the art, and is the dialogue and the writing getting lost? But I did think it's a nice way to open up different themes and to make the story feel more engaging. And I have to say, I love some of the illustrations that I see, even in the younger age books. So I'm really enjoying the different focus on illustration as well as the writing. So yeah.